Hello, and welcome back to Pegasus Rocketry. Let's kick off the channel's first build. And the first rocket we'll build is the Black Hole by Mach 1 Rocketry. I got this one in a 29mm motor mount. I chose this one because I need something that can be flown on a mid-power rocket and has dual deploy capability. I'm looking for fiberglass just to make it a little more bulletproof for a future project I'm working on. I also got the optional fiberglass nose cone as well as a switch band for the BT60 tubing. I'm planning on using an Aeropack motor retainer in 29mm. And then the fiberglass nose cone came with the little base and a little eye nut. So that's what the plan is. Let's get started, shall we? Let's go over the contents of the Black Hole kit. You'll get a pre-slotted aft airframe. You get a forward airframe. You will get a coupler with two stepped closures. You will receive a motor tube, 3 sets of fins, a plastic nose cone, a section of Kevlar shock cord, 2 small eye nuts with the appropriate screws, and some mini rail buttons. And you get 4 centering rings, one of them with these notches, the other 3 are solid. And that's the contents of the Black Hole kit. Hello, and a quick update to the unboxing. In the unboxing, I said I was going to use the Aeropack retainer. Not going to do that. We're going to use the Bandit retainer that you can order from Mach 1 Rocketry. I'm doing that because the Mach 1 tubing is so thin wall that the Aeropack retainer is so loose and has so much play. The first step in building fiberglass rockets is to clean off the mold release compound. In order to do this, I will give the fiberglass tubes a good scrubbing with some blue shop towels and some denatured alcohol. So let's get scrubbing. Just take a section of paper towel and put a little denatured alcohol on it. And start rubbing down my tubes. And now we've got the preliminary washing of the fiberglass completed. Let's get to the dry fitting. Now that I've removed the release compound from the fiberglass tubes, I am dry fitting and coming up with a game plan for assembly. So they did provide 4 centering rings. I'm only going to go with 3, which will be plenty for the size of the rocket and the size of the motor, so I'm not worried there. But I think it would be a little tight with as close as they would have to be to avoid the fins. And I want to size the shock cord loop so that I have about 1 inch, 1.5 inches sticking out the front of the body tube. This gives me a section to attach my shock cord and be able to replace it easily. And I want to leave about 1 inch, 1.5 inches behind that forward centering ring to be able to epoxy it in place to secure it. I have taken the motor tube and sanded it down with some 220 grit sandpaper, as well as the centering rings, and have washed everything down with some more denatured alcohol, preparing it for epoxy. Now I'm placing the centering rings on the motor mount and fishing the shock cord under the forward centering ring, making sure everything's ready to go when the epoxy is mixed. And now I mix the epoxy with 1 pump of the West Systems 105 resin and 1 pump of the 206 slow hardener. And now I mix it thoroughly before adding the colloidal silica to thicken it. I use about 1.5 scoops with a plastic spoon of the colloidal silica to get the thick consistency I desire. Be sure to wear some respiratory protection. These particles are very fine and will get into your lungs. Be sure to mix slowly at first to incorporate the powder. Once it starts to get incorporated, make sure you mix very thoroughly. I'm going for a thick, creamy mixture that stays in place without running. I'm using a 6cc syringe with a 14 gauge applicator and just applying the epoxy around all the centering rings. I'm using a ruler to make sure I'm getting that rear centering ring in place. Making sure to leave room for the fin and make room for the motor retainer. Now I'm just using extra epoxy to hold the shock cord in place, not going over the top because it'll stand off too high, interfering with the body tube. Now I'm just thickening up some of these fillets. And this is the fully epoxied motor tube. And it's the following day. I have let the epoxy cure overnight. Everything is solidified and hardened. So we are ready for the next step. Let's take a look. Now we will insert it into our main body tube and perform a dry fit. Make sure everything is looking good. Make sure everything fits. Nice and snug. And use the retainer. And I use the retainer to set the depth so that we'll have a flush fit. And it looks like everything was measured perfectly. We don't have any of the centering rings in the way for the fins. The shock cord is coming out the end just the way I wanted. So I think we are good. We will take this out. We will clean the inside of this body tube and sand it up a little bit and prepare it to bond our motor tube. Let's give that a shot. So just as before, I will use some denatured alcohol and some blue shop towels. And I'm just going to force it through. Oh yeah. You can see we got a lot of the mold release. So we'll just run it a few times. Now we're ready for sanding. And we're back from sanding the body tube. I used this dowel, wrapped it in some 220 grit sandpaper, taped it onto the dowel, and just started sanding the lower section where the motor mount with the centering rings will be attached. So now we need to clean the prepped area with more denatured alcohol to get rid of all the fiberglass dust so that we have a good surface to bond to. So insert this guy. And use the motor retainer to set the depth. We're good there. And let's get the rotation set up so that the retaining shock cord is not lined up with any of the slots for the fins. And now we're golden. We're ready to epoxy it in place. So we're going to use a 5/32 drill bit. I'm going to put that in right over here. So now we have all the holes we need. Let's go ahead and start injecting some epoxy. Using a 6cc syringe and a 14 gauge applicator, we will inject some unthickened epoxy from West System. I'm going to inject this epoxy into all of the fin slots to secure the centering rings to the body. I am pulling back slightly on the syringe before removing to keep from dripping. Now I inject into the hole I drilled just above the forward centering ring to secure it to the body. I didn't get a 360-degree flow, so I drill another hole and inject more epoxy into the forward centering ring. It's the next day and I take some thickened West Systems epoxy and secure the rear centering ring to the body tube and apply a bead around the motor mount to secure the motor retainer. I have just sanded the body with some 220 grit sandpaper along with the fins, and I am now wiping them down with denatured alcohol, preparing for bonding with epoxy. Using a syringe full of the thickened West Systems epoxy, I am using a 14 gauge applicator to fill in the gaps between the motor mount and the body tube. I'm now just going to stuff the fins in and use a 3D printed retainer to hold them in place. By this point, you know the drill, more denatured alcohol before we bond with epoxy. And now we've got another syringe full of West Systems thickened epoxy. We're just going to fill in the motor slots, filling the gap between the motor mount and the body tube. Now let's stuff the fins into the slots and use a 3D printed fin guide to hold them. I'm using extra clamps to align the front and rear fins to ensure proper alignment. Now I'm using a 12cc syringe with the 14 gauge applicator with some thickened West Systems epoxy. I'm injecting into the crease of the fin and the body and using a metal ball tool to smooth it out, creating the fillet, making sure that the tape is in place where it reaches the edges of the ball. And I'm just slowly working my way around the rocket. The epoxy is thick enough that it's not going to run. Now I'm using a Q-tip dipped in denatured alcohol to clean off some of the excess and shape the fillets at the leading edge of the fin. At this point, the epoxy should have thickened up but not completely cured. If this is the case, you should be able to peel your tape cleanly, leaving nice crisp edges. And this is how I build the fin can for my Mach 1 black hole. Join us next time where we tackle the electronics bay and recovery. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.